So I've gone live now. We're recording about a minute ahead, so I'm going to be here ready to get started as people are logging in. But I wanted to get going right on time because this is a big topic to me. And even though today's presentation will be a little bit more survey in nature, I also wanted to make sure that there was plenty of time for questions at the end. What I've been learning over the last several sessions that we've had these presentations is that when we get to the finish line, there aren't necessarily as many questions, and I guess people have felt that the coverage has been sufficiently thorough that I've anticipated questions that might arise. I'm not confident that that'll happen this time because this is such a wide open topic. And my experience when I've talked about Disgust in other settings is that it raises many more questions than I can possibly answer. And so my expectation is that something like that may happen again today. So I see that it's exactly noon. I'm going to get started again. So I want to thank you all for registering and joining today. My name is Dean McKay. I'm professor of psychology at Fordham University, and I have the great pleasure of being on the board of advisors for Better Living Center for Behavioral Health. And Better Living, as you know, is the ones that are sponsoring today's presentation, and all the ones that preceded it, and a couple more that are now scheduled, with additional ones likely in the near that will be planned as we go along. Today's presentation is on disgust, an emotional state that I think has been gaining more and more attention among clinicians, and I think there's some unknown aspects to it in the general population of practitioners that today's presentation hopefully will begin to answer. I'll just give a little bit of background in addition to the discussion about this particular emotional state. My interest in it goes back a long, long time. I'll mention this more explicitly in the last scheduled presentation on imagery, where some of my interest in disgust came into play in really kind of shaping my own career. And so some people have told me that I have a knack for creating very disgusting imagery, just using the power of words. And so in our last session, I will get into some of that from a technical standpoint. But the emotion of disgust in general is one that we've not paid as much attention to in psychology in general. The research literature on it has consistently been limited. But nonetheless, it has really incredible importance for a whole bunch of psychological conditions that we routinely treat. And so that's my aim for today. And so let me go to my next slide then. Whoop, I removed it from the stage, sorry. What I did here. So I apologize, I hit the wrong thing. And doing so, share it, nice. Apologies, folks who are on here. I hit the wrong thing. I've never done that before. And doing this work with you guys. Slides. My apologies. Hold on a second. Get that happening in a sec. There we are. All right, back in gear. All right. So, get back to what I was doing. All right. So that little hiccup. Here's my overview for today. So first of all, I'm going to define disgust for all of you. Give you an overview of why this emotion is so important. We'll go over some of the methods of assessment for disgust. We'll go over its role in anxiety disorders, and we'll go over its role in eating disorders. I will mention that that is not an exhaustive list of psychological conditions for which disgust is implicated. We'll talk a little bit about some potential treatment directions, and I'll have a brief illustrative case, and then we'll have time for Q&A. So let's talk about disgust in general. So Darwin really was the first one that described disgust in a scientific setting, where the description of the emotion was specifically to protect us from taking in harmful food or other substances. It is a universally recognized emotion, meaning that cross-culturally, this facial expression that I have illustrated here is the quintessential disgust face. And you'll see there's some characteristic aspects of it that really mark how we know it is designed to protect us from ingesting things that are harmful. You'll see that the nose gets scrunched up. That's to make sure that we're detecting, in the fullest sense of the word, the odor emanating from whatever that food product is. The lips get pursed. There's a whole series of physiological reactions that are associated specifically and uniquely with disgust. And so collectively, given the nature of this emotional state, it's designed to detect things that might be harmful that we could ingest. Now, the salience of that for us is that it goes beyond just foods that are rotting or spoiled. Because evolution favors overcorrection, so I'm highlighting this important aspect, evolution really overcorrects to protect us from harm. So useful to keep that in mind when we think then about why disgust operates the way it does. So it includes then things that may not be harmful foods, but are unfamiliar. So let's say if you are culturally unfamiliar with certain foods, your initial reaction, especially as it varies more and more from foods that you're familiar with, then you are going to likely react with disgust to it. So that is an important additional component to keep in mind when we think about its protective factors, is that it includes things that may not in fact be harmful, but our bodies react to it as such. It extends beyond just the food to, and odors to sight, touch, and sound. So if something sounds like a disgusting food object or product that could be harmful, then we will react adversely to it. It includes tactile sensations. So it is an all-encompassing emotional state. And there have been more generalized descriptions of it, such as revulsion at the prospect of oral incorporation of an offensive object. So to give you an illustration of that, if you will, all of you on this presentation, engage in this very brief thought experiment. Think of the most reprehensible public figure that you can imagine, whoever that person may be, living or dead, and imagine kissing that person on the lips. That's the concept that Agile was describing with the concept of disgust. The oral incorporation of any offensive object. That includes oral contact with any offensive object. And so that includes an individual who you may find repulsive because of their view on things. It doesn't have to it extends way beyond just attractiveness. So those are really important considerations as we think about the scope of disgust in our lives, never mind just in clinical phenomena. Now, in addition to that, so I mentioned this, the physically observable reactions like the facial expression. There's also these well-validated psychophysiological responses. So in particular, the muscle tension in the maxilla, which is the area just below your nostrils, this lip area. So you'll see in the picture there, the thing there, and the nostrils. And more importantly, for our purposes, as you'll see in a moment, disgust, when it happens, lowers respiration, lowers heart rate, lowers blood pressure. That's really critical because most conditions that we think of, particularly, let's say, for anxiety disorders and for different kinds of conditions for which, let's say, we might employ exposure or other things that are associated with avoidance where we expect that there's going to be sympathetic arousal. Disgust actually has parasympathetic arousal. So I want you to kind of put a pin in that because that's going to play an important role for one clinical conditions as we'll see shortly. So disgust, I like to call it a communicable emotion. So what I mean by that is, if you think about other emotional states, you can induce sadness, fear in other people through words and through presentation of some stimuli. But disgust stands alone in the degree that you can really communicate it to someone in a way that has connection to an object. Now, if you don't believe me, let me show you for a second. So I have right on my desk here, I'm ready for this. Let me get in the camera area. So there's this little lip balm that I have here. Now, if I was hanging out with any of you in person, and I said to you, hey, I have this lip balm here. This lip balm is fine, but, you know, before now, it was encased in dog feces. I cleaned it off entirely. It never was open and exposed to the feces, so it's thoroughly clean. Will you be willing to use it? Now, I'm confident that all of you would say no. I would too. So here's this object. Now, you don't know whether it's true or not, but if I told you this and I just said, yeah, this happened, your reticence in using it immediately afterwards, even if I said to you after describing it and I said to you, oh yeah, I'm just kidding, but I described it in this way, you'd be hesitant to do so. That's the communicable nature of disgust in a moment's illustration. So let's talk about the elicitors are categories of stimuli. So we already mentioned one, food. That's the one for which disgust was originally described. It has boiled food, culturally unfamiliar food. Body products, so like feces in my description of my lip balm here. So body products are any things that come out of your body, of course, that is supposed to stay inside. Animals and insects are disgust elicitors. If you're not sure if this is true, think about mice, think about rats out in the wild, and now you see what I mean. Death is a disgust elicitor. Usually we think of that because it has to do with the idea of contagion associated with corpses. There is disease risk associated with decaying bodies, and so death is a known elicitor. Sex is an elicitor of disgust, not just for the body products associated with it, but also because of cultural norms that may govern sexual conduct. So sex ends up being a fairly substantial disgust elicitor. And then this last one that I listed here, body envelope violations, deserves a little bit of explanation. Body envelope violations is the idea that, let's say, the skin that covers one's body, one expects to be intact. And so any occasion that that skin surface is broken is a body envelope violation. And the extent of that break in the body envelope is also the extent to which you may experience disgust at the prospect of it. And this is any body, so not just humans, but any organism. The degree that it is disfigured and broken in its usually sealed form is a body envelope violation. Now, additionally unique to disgust are these two laws of sympathetic magic. So across each of these disgust elicitors, the laws of sympathetic magic apply. One is the law of contagion. The law of contagion basically says once a disgust-associated object is in contact with a neutral object, that neutral object takes on those characteristics. So to illustrate, what's important with this, by the way, before I explain the illustration, is that it does not have to actually possess disgusting qualities. It can be clean. So here's the illustration. In my lab at Fordham, we've been doing disgust-related research for many years. One of the behavioral avoidance tests that we had early on related to the law of contagion was someone would come into the lab, there'd be a cup, clean, and an unopened bottle of water, clear that the cap has retained its seal. In front of the participant, the seal would be cracked by the student experimenter. The water would be poured into the cup, which is made very clearly is a clean new cup. But then, before the participant is given a chance to try to drink the water, a label would be put on the cup. The label would simply say, saliva sample. Now, putting the label saliva sample on it is a contagion concept. We've now given it a quality that it didn't possess before. We've inserted for the participant a thought that it may have a contagion on it. That's the law of contagion. So notice again, nothing wrong with it inherently, it just has this label that would suggest something otherwise. The other is the law of similarity. The law of similarity is when some object resembles a disgust elicitor, then it would take on the disgust qualities. For those of you on this call that are old enough to remember the movie Caddyshack, this is played to classic effect when the pool at the country club has a Baby Ruth bar thrown into the pool, and all of the people in the pool mistakenly think that it is a human turd. And so they evacuate the pool. And anyway, so I won't give it away in terms of what happens at the end, but it is played to comedic effect to the end. So that concept guides all of the disgust elicitors in terms of how it provokes a disgusting reaction in an individual. So these are all normative experiences of disgust for us to keep in mind when we think about when things expand to have pathological impact. So there are some measures for disgust that are out there. The measures for disgust that I listed here, the self-report scales, are all available freely. They are not proprietary measures. I'll add, though, there also are not clinical norms for any of these scales. And so if you were to administer it to anybody, it would be purely for tracking changes, but you don't have a cutoff point where you'd say, okay, now you're down into, let's say, the normal range on any particular measure. It's useful for consideration, and maybe if you're doing research on this topic, you may find it to be valuable as you include it in any kind of assessment. But I just want to keep in mind for all of you that there is no clinical cutoff. So some of these, there's the disgust emotion scale. The disgust emotion scale is really the first measure of disgust that was developed. It is intended to assess the extent that someone gets disgusted by things. So you'll see the DES is out there in some published work. It's a pretty general measure. The next one after that was developed, probably the most widely used one, maybe not the most useful for our purposes as clinicians, but the disgust sensitivity scale, it has 16 items, and each of the items assesses the disgust reactions that someone might have at the prospect of engaging with any of the various disgust elicitors that I've listed previously. So it's literally tapping into each of those domains. There's 16 questions that rate that as a true, false, would you or would you not have that? And then there's another 16 that have a separate set of items also for each of the elicitors. And it rates the degree that someone might engage with that stimuli. So it's actually 32 items, so I misspoke, I apologize. There's the disgust propensity and sensitivity scale. This is the one that I personally probably find the most useful. And the reason why is because it's very clear in categorizing someone's disgust reaction into two broad domains. One, disgust propensity, which is how readily do you get disgusted by things in the world? So things that are expected to be disgusting, how much do you find them disgusting? How readily do you get disgusted by them? And then disgust sensitivity, which is the degree that you are sensitive to physical sensations that resemble disgust. How much are you attuned to that? So you may not be widely disgusted by things, but when you are, you feel it physically more so. This particular measure is 16 items. There's a newer short form available of that measure. I think it's 8 items. So it's a pretty quick, easy to administer measure. So if you're interested in that, I would recommend it. I will add one note. Research has shown that the DPSS is associated with some clinical states, particularly anxiety conditions that have disgust associated with them. I'll mention then there are some emergent associated clinical states that have a disgust component. So the one that I'm going to highlight is the chills. I like this one because the chills has real resonance for a particular type of OCD symptom that I'll describe soon. The chills is the reaction that one gets at the prospect of a contaminant penetrating the skin. So it's a unique blend of disgust and fear. Uh, like I said, we'll describe it a little bit more later. We had some recent experimental work in my lab that tested this, and it's really a fascinating concept. There's a nice measure of the chills that's out there, and it blends in some other unique emotional experiences. So it's a pretty short measure if you're interested in assessing the chills. I'll talk about later. The other way to go with this, you could develop your own behavioral avoidance tests. You could be creative with this. Behavioral avoidance tests like the one I mentioned with the saliva sample. In that study, we also had done one where we had served participants Famous Amos cookies. So if you remember the Famous Amos brand cookies, they'd be little, like bite-sized chocolate chip cookies. And we would serve them on a clean, unused, and unarmed rat trap. Now, if you're familiar with rat traps, of course, they're kind of large. They're like the size of a plate. And we would clearly disarm the snapping mechanism. So the arm that would otherwise kill the rodent was floppy. And we put cookies on them. And we'd say, here, try these out if you're interested. So you could develop a test of your own. We've had some others. If you have the equipment and you have, let's say, biofeedback equipment in your office, you could do psychophysiological assessment. So the psychophysiological assessment, of course, would be in conjunction with some disgust stimuli, and you test to see whether or not it changes. You would especially be interested in muscular tension along the upper lip, or if you have small enough electrodes, put it along the outer nostril, you would see change here like that. And then your control spot would be like the shoulder. The shoulder is generally unaffected. There's an emergent area that we're going to talk about with eating disorders called gastric rhythm. Some of you may be aware that your stomach has a beat. The beat is about 3 beats a minute. In some conditions associated with low body weight, that beat will be lower. Gastric rhythm is an emergent area for some conditions as indicators of disgust. Now, as you think about it evolutionarily, it makes sense. Your gastric rhythm would slow down if you ingested something harmful, or if you perceive that something that you took in was harmful. You want to slow down the metabolism. So gastric rhythm is somewhat correlated with metabolic rate. And so you want the system to not metabolize that stuff as quickly if it's potentially harmful. You want to give the system an opportunity to expel it basically out the door it came in. So that notion is what's at work with the gastric rhythm. Okay, so let's spend a moment on the chills. I apologize. My slide here, I can see that the format did not translate well when I loaded it. I'm going to guess that may happen with a couple of them, so my apologies for this. Let's pay attention to the chills for a second. So remember, I just described it as the fear. It's the unique blend of fear and disgust at the prospect of a contaminant penetrating the body, usually through the skin, maybe through some other orifice or some other means. For those of you that are sci-fi fans, the chills is illustrated to brilliant effect in the movie Alien Covenant. I won't give it away, except that a bodily cavity is involved in 2 scenes, one in the nostrils and one in the ears. And it's a really excellent illustration of this concept. It's particularly relevant to contamination fear. So for those of you that maybe have done a close read of Foa and Kozak's classic article where they describe the process of habituating to feared stimuli, their article in 1986 rather, in the Psych Bulletin article, volume 99, pages 20 to 35. Not that I've cited it too much in my travels. There's a passage in that article where they describe how an individual who was in one of their studies reacted when they put a bit of urine on his arm. So what they were doing was looking to see about physiological reactions and habituation rates. And they were doing it with skin response. So they were doing GSR response. And they found when they first put the urine on this man's arm, who had contamination fear, that it had the immediate predictable uptick and anxiety. But then it almost as quickly cratered. So it didn't follow a habituation pattern. Instead, it just went and dropped precipitously. And the reason was that this guy who was part of the study said internally, I was freezing the location of the urine on my skin, and I knew that I was contained. But the concept of the chills was at work because, remember, the concept is that it's a contaminant that's going to penetrate the skin. And on closer inspection, individuals who experience that kind of emotional blend, that GSR is probably the most relevant one. And it explains in part why so many psychophysiological evaluations in OCD fail to find a good response, because it may activate both sympathetic arousal and parasympathetic arousal, and then there is sort of like a modulation effect. There has been more recently some experimental work in my lab, so I'll cite my student Lauren Mancusi, who graduated a couple of years ago, whose work involved testing this out, and rather than with contaminants like urine, instead we use something that is a known object that some of you, if you're freshwater fish enthusiasts, would be familiar with, and that's bloodworms. So I picture the experimental stimuli in that lower corner. Bloodworms, well, they look like what they're named, but what's also appealing about them for an experiment like this is that they're very thin. And so if you had them on your arm, the perception might be very readily that they could penetrate the skin. And so the concept of the chills was being assessed, and we found that this was a useful behavioral avoidance test for evaluating the degree that the chills would be relevant in participants. And it is relevant in particularly people who have contamination fear. So that's an easy, pretty inexpensive, and ethical kind of behavioral avoidance test, and actually probably an exposure test that you could put together with clients. You can get bloodworms at most pet stores that sell freshwater fish. You can get them live. They look, when you get them in the cup, they look like it's wiggly. It looks like a wiggly pool of blood, frankly. Okay, so disgust in anxiety disorders. So you'll see that my first two bullets kind of went off the screen, so my apologies. But one, specific phobias. So for animals, so like snakes. Snakes will provoke a disgust reaction, in part because of where they live, not because snakes are inherently disgusting. People do find them to be unappealing, but they tend to live in places that are not clean. So people find them to be unappealing. Same with insects. So people who are spider fearful are also blood injury and injection phobia is a body envelope violation. It has to do with the idea that the skin is being penetrated, and so that provokes a disgust reaction and also has the chills associated with it. Now, a moment on that. So blood injury injection phobia, for those of you familiar with treatment for that, when you do exposure, the risk is very great that the person may pass out. The passing out reaction is a disgust reaction. So let's think about why that happens. So when somebody gets, it's the only phobia really where passing out is associated with it. And partly because as the person anticipates that they're going to have a blood draw, their anxiety is higher and higher and higher, right? So high levels of anxiety reaction. At the moment that the needle is about to penetrate the skin, there's a sudden drop. The sudden drop is because of that disgust reaction. Been experimentally tested over and over again over the last 10 to 12 years, and it's that sudden drop that leads to the person fainting. And so that's why for blood injection phobia, one of the things that people practice is applied tension. Applied tension is to offset that parasympathetic reaction. So contamination fear, like I said, the chills is relevant. Emetophobia, some of you may be familiar with emetophobia, the fear of vomiting. That's a body product related fear. Obviously, it's the expulsion of food after it has spent any time in the body. So if you read some of the experimental literature on disgust, by the way, there's an interesting thing that they have out there. there's a series of studies that were done out of University of Pennsylvania. So a lot of this work originated with somebody at UPenn named Paul Rosen. And one of the things he talks about is if someone were to, let's say, have food in their mouth and they stuck their tongue out with the food balled up on their tongue, you know, the kind of things that really like any teenage boy might do, because teenage boys will do that kind of thing. They're disgusting creatures. I know because I was one. But the question is, how long can your tongue be out of your mouth with partially chewed food resonant on the tongue? How long can it be out of your mouth before it's acceptable to the individual that has it on their tongue, acceptable to bring it back into their mouth to be consumed? That question varies by individual. Some people can have no tolerance for that at all, right? As your disgust propensity goes up, the ability to tolerate that for any time at all is very low. And so you would not be willing to do that. And then some people tolerate for a longer period of time. But everybody has sort of a ceiling. The highest, if I recall correctly from Rosen's work, was not more than 2 minutes. Most people will not allow that before retreating back into it. So emetophobia is a variant of this, where it's food that has been in one's body, and for any period of time, if it is expelled, that would be unacceptable. And then experiencing and observing vomit in any place, also not acceptable. This is one that you may have heard recently. It's an atypical phobia, but it's really primarily disgust-driven. To call it a phobia is actually an incorrect use of the word phobia. That's tryptophobia. So I have on this slide a lotus seed pod. The lotus seed pod is the quintessential tryptophobic stimuli. Another one that would provoke it, by the way, would be a honeycomb. Any surface that has a lot of holes on it. Now, what is that association about? Why disgust here? Well, the issue is that people with tryptophobia most likely at some point previously had a very severe skin infection. There's actually this really interesting line of dermatological research that suggests this association. And so it's an evolved protective feature. If you've had a skin infection, you're also then much more susceptible to other infections. And that includes then reminders of those infections. So the lotus seed pod, for example, is a great example of this. And if you've seen, those of you that have been to the dermatologist and you go into the office while you're waiting to get examined, you look at the various medical images on the wall, it usually is of pockmarked skin. And the various pockmarks are indicative of different kinds of skin lesions, that when someone has this, the risk of other infection is very great. So tryptophobia is basically a way for the individual who has had these previous kinds of infections really avoid any images of it. So it's a really fascinating kind of problem. You may have heard about it in the news about a year and a half ago during the Super Bowl. There was an ad for what was then the new iPhone. And the new iPhone had on the back this display of 3 holes. When they showed this, there were all these negative reactions that were being posted online about people who felt that their tryptophobia had been triggered by it, and probably was. Okay, so I mentioned before disgust and disorders of low body weight. So the point of assessment here is gastric rhythm. There are some special assessments. If one were to go to a gastroenterologist, gastric rhythm can be assessed. There's, as I understand it, unobtrusive methods of assessing gastric rhythm. And it has recently come under more intense scrutiny as a potential component of assessing beneficial outcomes in treatment for people with low body weight conditions like anorexia. So there is a current experimental investigation ongoing here in New York that I'm aware of. Full disclosure, I'm a consultant on the grant for that study, and it includes a disgust-targeted intervention. I'm not really at liberty to talk too much about the actual intervention, also because it's experimental, and the study is actually just getting up and running officially. They've just gotten the funding through for it. But I will mention that there is a specific disgust targeted intervention for that. I want you to kind of hold on to that one too for a moment because we're going to talk about that in a second. The treatments of disgust. As we sit here now, there are not any empirically supported or evidence-based approaches to treating disgust. There are a lot of different things that have been tried, and the outcomes are highly variable. I'll add one note. Funding agencies that would support research potentially have not yet really seen the public health relevance of targeting disgust. And so, like I mentioned before, just a second ago on that other slide, when it comes to disorders of low body weight, well, any intervention that you can come up with that might have traction has high public health relevance because of the way eating disorders take place and how they are among the few psychiatric conditions where the actual disorder may lead to death. So it is something that's worth continuing to look at. I have here then a brief list of some candidate interventions, but it's important to know that none of them have really been validated. So there's a lot of different research that's either uncontrolled, some case series. I've contributed to this literature, but I will be the first to acknowledge that it is not necessarily the most rigorous and well-controlled because just the luxury of being able to do so, the resources to do so have not been there. So the sampling of attempted interventions, one is exposure. Exposure in this case, though, it assumes that habituation to disgust would take place, which also assumes comparable neural systems, given that one of the things that is targeted in disgust is the learning system for avoidance. So with fear, that's well established. We know the fear circuitry is a fairly well developed line of research. So we know when you do exposure, there are predictable changes in the circuitry. We don't know that much with disgust. The neural systems are totally different. The neural system emanates from the insula rather than the amygdala. And so we don't really know if exposure is the right idea. We do know that when you do exposure for disgust, it just takes much, much longer than for fear states. You could do interoceptive exposure. That's where some of the current action is centered right now. So let's say interoceptive exposure. If one of the areas that is relevant to disgust is in the GI tract, right? If, let's say, disgust evokes nausea when the gastric rhythm is disrupted, then one other thing you could do is you could create a little bit of that. So one of the things that I've done, at least, is I've created some GI disruption in some clients. I'm going to describe it in a moment with an illustrative case. And that would be one method of potentially targeting the disgust system. There probably are others, but that's the one that I've been centered on. Another one is counter-conditioning. Counter-conditioning is hard to pull off because it assumes that you could find some appetitive or desirable stimuli that will be of equal weight to compete with the disgust stimuli. I've not personally found that. Counter-conditioning is very difficult to put together. And I guess it goes by this adage, the way that it goes, a drop of wine in a bucket of feces will have no benefit on the feces. A drop of feces in a bottle of wine will render the wine unusable. So with that in mind, coming up with a comparable stimuli for counter-conditioning is very difficult to imagine. People have tried it, though. There is some experimental literature on it, and it's like with modest benefit. And it requires, again, a lot of trials. And then finally, there's been some efforts at cognitive interventions. Now, unlike other conditions, let's say if you think about the cognitive work that's been done in anxiety disorders, where you can point to specific biases that one might have that guide and maintain anxiety conditions. We don't have that much with disgust. If you ask people what makes something disgusting, what are the consequences of this, or some variant of those kind of questions, people usually just say it's icky. They don't have necessarily a thought attached to it. That's fairly robust. Now, a different way to look at it, though, if we are insisting on thinking about a cognitive model, would be conceptual reorganization. Now, that is something that is completely unknown. I'll give you an example, though. Let's say if somebody had an intense, overwhelming disgust reaction in general, right? So they have like an overgeneralized disgust reaction, and you start talking with them about feces, which are inherently disgusting, right? As disgust stimuli go, it's hard to top. You could, however, engage in some conceptual reorganization around that by talking about things like fecal implants. Now, those of you who are listening right now, if you're medically minded, you may have heard about fecal implants. Fecal implants are used for people who have disorders of the lower intestines and colon, where there's an imbalance in what they call the gut microbiome. And fecal implants are intended to help ensure that the bacteria that are resident in your lower intestines and colon are the ones that you need. In other words, basically, there's a lot of bacteria that you're supposed to have, and some people have conditions marked by an imbalance in those bacteria. Well, now you're suddenly engaged in a discussion about things that are useful that we usually think of as disgusting. That kind of conceptual reorganization puts things in a new context for people. Another way to put it, without being quite as icky, that I use for people is I talk about how in order to stay healthy, you're not supposed to change your sheets that often. The research on this is actually fairly clear. And I like to use a little bit of dramatic flair with this. The saying that I routinely say to people is, you're supposed to marinate a little bit in your own filth. Now, again, that conceptual reorganization, that imagery and the evocation is something that's intended to specifically shift the more rigid, crystallized association between disgust and whatever the object is, and now regarded in a new light. This is completely unknown, though. It is a concept that is on the table that I'm aware of some work being done on, but the benefits are as yet completely unknown. Okay, so let me give you a little illustrative case. So the case in question, I like this one because it isolates it in a very specific way. It also isolates it in a way that really is not inherently yucky. Okay, so for those of you that have been on this call and are thinking, I'm like really thinking I want to eat something now, it's near lunchtime because I'm on the East Coast, and you've been like, wait a second, he just said something at the beginning that I shouldn't. I'm pretty confident you could eat through the discussion I'm about to give you now. Okay, so that's my little warning or caveat rescinded from before. So the client in question, I was treating this woman for OCD, completely unrelated to the issue at hand here. So she's an interesting case because of this one thing that was like a sidebar in the course of treatment. So she was getting treated for OCD. She had contamination fear. She had a whole bunch of other symptoms. She was anxious in a very general way. Rather complex case, frankly. But then, kind of happenstance, in the course of working with her, she said to me that she was worried because she needed to go for an eye exam. A routine kind of thing. The kind of thing that in the course of treating most clients, you probably don't really hear people talk about that much, particularly not with respect to an apprehension that they might have about going. So anyway, so she mentions to me, I'm supposed to go to the eye doctor. I'm really concerned about it. I need to get a glaucoma test. And I know there's a part where they have to maybe, pull on and lift my eyelid up a little bit in order to get drops on my eye. And I was meeting with her virtually. So I was meeting with her much in the same way as I'm coming to you guys right now. And I said to her, oh, you mean like this? And she's like, oh, got very upset and reported to me that she felt such an intense reaction that she actually felt lightheaded. This is someone who, by the way, at this point, during the time I had known her, I did not know her to be particularly dramatic. So the fact that she said she was lightheaded, I think, was actually quite notable. And it was not a dramatic reaction. She had what was considered a very extreme disgust reaction related specifically to the eyes. It included things like, for herself, getting an eye exam where she knew there'd be contact near her eye area. It included watching if her husband was putting contact lenses in. It included watching if every now and then, if you watch some shows, every now and then, randomly, unexpectedly, there'll be some focus on the eyes. She would have big trouble with that. So what we ended up doing was, in a couple of parts, it was over just a couple of sessions. It was a fairly quick thing. Spent some time on interoceptive exposure just for the disgust sensation. So we wanted to isolate the disgust reaction that she had right there in session with me. Right happenstance, I did this one thing like that, like a demonstration. She reacted very sad. So we did this where I had her press on her abdomen just below her rib cage in order to simulate the kind of disruption to the GI tract that might be associated with the disgust reaction. We did that. Then I had her watch her husband put contact lenses in while engaged in applied tension. So we rehearsed this during the session, the applied tension part. And the applied tension, if you've ever done this with clients, it's a weird thing to have them do because most clients, especially if they're seeing you for other anxiety problems, they expect you to train them to relax. And for her in the past, because of some other things that she had going on, unrelated to OCD, we did do some things that were related to relaxing. We had some like breathing exercises that were part of her treatment. So now here I go and I turn around and I say, okay, listen, when you're watching as your husband puts his contact lenses in and work this out with him that you would do this, I want you to tighten up your hands and arms, make a fist. I want you to feel that tension in your upper body, right? So I wanted core tightening, right? I wanted large muscle groups to be affected. Tightening back, shoulders, get all of that nice and tight as he puts it in, and relax. When he puts it in the other eye, same thing, tighten up. It's under controlled circumstances with applied tension. We had her practice that numerous times, and we got to the point where I had her watching her husband putting his contacts in without immediately using the applied tension because she got better at it. What ended up happening, so in session, so I was able to do this a lot, both eyes. I had her doing it during the session. I would do the thing I'd get like nice and underneath like this. Those of you that are attending, if you have problems with this, email me and talk about how to get to the bottom of that. And then the behavioral outcome, to me, the success really had little to do with the fact that she was able to see me do this kind of stuff and that she could do it too. She went and had that eye exam. She didn't pass out. She didn't need any kind of assistance with getting the task done. She did need to be driven home because she had to have her pupils dilated because for those of you that have been to the eye doctor, you know that there comes a point in your life where pupil dilation to inspect the retina is a routine part of any thorough eye exam. So she was able to successfully do this. So that, to me, is a great indicator. Okay, so some conclusions. Like I said, I promised there'll be some time for Q&A from this. So I hope you're prepared with questions and answers. Disgust is an essential emotion present in ways big and small every day. Now that we've talked about it today, hopefully there's some consciousness of raising for all of you. Pay attention to where disgust comes up in your everyday life. You'll be amazed at how widespread it is, not only in the things that we talk about today, but in other areas. It is still vastly under-recognized in psychiatric conditions. The scope of research on disgust in psychiatric disorders is dwarfed by pretty much every other emotional state, including emotional states that are understudied themselves, like happiness. It is implicated in numerous conditions, so there is research on a wide range of emotional, of psychiatric conditions for which disgust is associated. Today's coverage, like I said at the beginning, was really just a partial listing. I'm going to give you a more detailed listing in a second. And treatment for pathological disgust is still very much in development. It's in its infancy. We're probably due for an updated review on it. About 10 years ago, close to 11 or 12 years ago, there was an article in Clinical Psychology, Science and Practice by Mason and Richardson that talks about the available treatments for disgust back then. And I could tell you now, 10 years later, after that article came out in 2012, that the state of the science is really not that much different than it was then. So I'm going to give what I would consider really just a shameless plug for an edited book that I'm working on. This has just been commissioned by Cambridge. The invitations to authors has just been sent out, but we do have a textbook that's going to get developed on the examination of disgust in psychiatric conditions. The prior book on this topic came out 14 years ago by the same editors, myself and Bumi Olatunji. This is now a greatly expanded text. In the intervening 14 years, there has been some research in this area, as I mentioned, but still very much behind. And I put here a little selected table of contents of what will be in that text. And it includes a lot of different conditions. So you'll see, for example, we talked about several here: animal phobias, blood injection and injury phobia, contamination fear, eating disorders. But there's research on the role that disgust plays in health, anxiety, in depression, trauma, and PTSD. And atypical phobias, I mentioned a couple of them today, emetophobia and tryptophobia being among them. So with that, I want to just remind you all, first of all, thank you again for coming to today's training. We're at the one here on Disgust. As you know, there are 4 previous ones that are available for your listening pleasure. If you go to Better Living Center for Behavioral Health's webpage, you can find those there. There are 2 more upcoming that are scheduled, like I said, with more planned. So pay attention to the social media feeds for those as they come about. But the next one will be in 2 weeks on panic subtypes and exposure for them. And then May 17th, where I'll talk about developing imagery for exposure therapy. So with that, I will thank you all for being here. And I look forward to hearing your questions. So please drop some questions in the chat. Happy to answer anything that you would like to go over. The 9 of you who are active on today's training, I look forward to hearing some questions from you guys. Okay, so Rodrigo has asked, thank you, Rodrigo. So I said that disgust is considered a universal emotion. Is there any data regarding whether there are cultural influences on the way it is expressed or modulated? So it's a great question. So the research on cross-cultural expressions of disgust show that the facial expression is universal. Physiological experience of it is pretty universal. What varies cross-culturally are the target stimuli that elicit disgust. So that, I think, is really the way to look at this. So, for example, in some cultures, things like certain insects are not necessarily disgust elicitors. That is because in some cultures, certain insects are consumed. So that is an important element that plays a role in how cultural expression varies. Remember, I mentioned that food and unfamiliar food products can elicit disgust. And the example that I love to use, next time I go there, I'm going to sample this. So check in with me again about this in a couple of months. There's a Mexican restaurant in Manhattan that serves an authentic kind of taco that includes grasshoppers. Now, apparently in some provinces of Mexico, there are some native grasshoppers that are food sources. And insects, by the way, are an emergent area that are considered high protein and maybe the future of food. And so that is an example of how this might be modulated. You could see this also in very regional ways. Some people who are from the north, if they go to some other sections of this country, there are foods that are eaten routinely that people from other geographic regions would reject out of hand. So, Candy, thank you for the kudos. And so Michelle is asking whether, when treating disgust-based OCD with exposure, do I recommend that people refrain from safety behaviors or rituals, or continue to use them, but in a more limited manner? So that's a great question. And my answer is going to be a little more anecdotal. So this is not driven by any data. So the treatment literature on this, and when thinking about safety behaviors, I would still, at the moment, argue for using them in a limited manner. And the safety behavior issue, I guess, also, this is again in the category, this is firmly in the category of stuff Dean McKay thinks, and not necessarily what the research literature thinks. So my approach to this with safety behaviors is that safety behaviors are an evolved thing. And so I always try to be judicious about how I fade those out with clients. And so when it comes to disgust-related exposure, I kind of follow the same script. Do them in a more limited manner before eliminating them altogether. I don't necessarily advocate for using them fully because you want the person to experience the emotional state at least a little bit. And so I have a little bit more of a moderate stance on it. So I hope I answered your question. I feel like I kind of was a little less clear at the end there, but I hope that covered well. Thank you for these questions. While I'm waiting for a question to be formulated for the next couple of minutes that we have together, I'll mention one other thing for those of you that are interested. I've thought a lot about disgust and its applications, not only to clinical conditions, but in society at large. And I've been so fortunate over the years. I co-teach a course for undergraduates, and it's an advanced seminar at Fordham where my university has the distinction of having 2 disgust experts. There's myself in the psychology department and an English professor who he and I have taught this advanced seminar for the last 10 years. And we cover everything from the most basic stuff like food, body products, but we go all the way up to morality. And the stuff with moral injury, by the way, which really probably deserves a whole separate session, is one of the dimensions where disgust plays a role in trauma. So just a teaser for you, but if you look in the research literature on this, you'll notice probably now that I mentioned it out loud, the one facet of disgust that I left off the table deliberately, by the way, was moral disgust, mainly because it's a very complex topic and it deserves much more special consideration than some of the other dimensions that we covered today. So if any of you are interested in the syllabus for my undergraduate course, I will be happy to share it with you. We have a lot of interesting things on there. And anyway, to me, it's one of the most intellectually fascinating things that I do in my academic life. Are there any other questions? We have a couple of minutes left. I could probably field one more question with the time remaining. No? Well, hearing no other questions, my offer stands as it has week over week. If you have anything that you want to ask me, feel free to email me. I will do my best to get back to you in a timely way. You can email me at deanmckayphd@gmail.com. I want to also again thank Better Living Center for Behavioral Health for hosting these, being such great partners, and working together on getting a chance to bring this information out to the public. I've really enjoyed working with them these months, and I look forward to continuing to in the future. So with all of that, once again, thank you. Have a wonderful day, and hope to see you again in 2 weeks when we get to talk about panic.